Hello, everyone, and welcome to the What is Smart podcast. My name is Garrett Wilhelm, the founder of the Gardens Foundation, and today we have an amazing guest with us. His name is Dr. Damian Bebell. If I got that right, make sure to correct me, doctor. He has over 20 years of expertise and experience helping schools and policymakers with data, technology, and empirical research to support educational initiatives. He currently serves as an assistant research professor at Boston College's Lynch School of Education and Human Development, offering research and evaluation services to evolve teaching and learning practices. He's also authored the school mission statement with Dr. Steven Stemler. Did I get that right? Yeah. Steven Stemler, focusing on the importance of aligning educational practices with schools' broader mission. Dr. Bebell, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And would you say that's an overall good summary of your career and history, or would you like to add anything else?
Sure. I mean, I think no one, wakes up one day and says, I want to become an educational researcher. But through a strange course of events, I found myself in this position. And so for 25 years, I've designed and conducted studies around the world, helping classrooms, schools, larger organizations like districts or governments even better understand the investments that they're making in education. And often that's educational technology, but not always.
Not always. And yeah, you say, some organizations like Apple. I don't want to, that small organization out there. It's fascinating work that Dr. Bebell has done, and I can't wait to share with the community out there. And so we like to start all of our podcasts with the title question, the question that we all think about, at least us education dorks, right? The question is to you, Dr. Bebell, what is SMART?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I was hoping in preparing for this conversation that I'd have a more succinct and a better answer, but I'll admit that I don't know. And as an educational researcher, we've tried to study this and we've tried to measure it. And so, how to know or define something for us is like, can it be measured? So as an educational researcher, as a quantitative scientist, the lens that I bring professionally to a question like this is, well, how do we measure what SMART is? Or how have we historically done that? And that opens up all kinds of avenues. And so in my professional work, as we sort of alluded to, we admitted that, when a school or an organization would reach out to us asking for help around a study, we would be asking them, how do you measure success? What is learning really look like? How do we know it's working? How do we know this program, this device, whatever it might be, is having the intended impact? And we found that going back to the schools was the right way to do that. And as soon as I felt like I understood what success meant, I was in a different community, or the context changed.
Yeah.
And I was using a definition from 10 or 15 years ago. So what I've learned cumulatively, and to get to the, something that's approaching a real answer to your question, is that SMART is contextual and it's evolving. And so I think as soon as we put our thumb on what we say it is, it might not fit for that next generation of students that are coming into a community. And, for a whole lot of different reasons that we can argue about. But in my role, it's been, how do we serve that question in a discrete period of time for a discrete community? And I've been really lucky, as you said, to have some amazing partners, both big and small. But you might imagine, working with the very first generation of kindergarten classrooms that were given, that purchased, I should say, were given, but the school district went out and they've got.
There's no freebies at Apple, that's for sure.
There's no freebies anywhere, right?
Yep.
So, studying the first school district, this was Auburn Public Schools in Maine, actually, a small school district up in the middle of the state that has about 10 elementary schools. Each of them have kindergartens. And they had these literacy problems, such that by fourth grade, their definition of success was measured by state assessments. And so they could look at the iPad as a device to improve academic and cognitive literacy over time, such that kids with this exposure and with these tools and with teachers that were trained and all the things that go along with it would lead to measurable increases over time in the students' success indicator, which in this case
Was
were things like the hearing and recording sounds and words assessment, or the STARS assessment, or, common NCREL type, common off the shelf standardized tests.
that's
So
right.
the point is that, we define SMART for ourselves in our own community. And most schools that I've worked with have been lucky enough to have some say in what success is. And yes, the policymakers and our school boards and our, state government and our constitutions even sometimes define what education means. But we're often given a fair amount of latitude with at the school or classroom level and how to interpret that. And so therein lies the opportunity and the promise. And as an outsider, you mentioned the work around mission statements. We would look at a school's mission statement and we would see, what are they defining is their goal or the educational objective for themselves, for their community, for parents, what's on the wall of the office, what's on the front page of the website. And
The
are we
shirt.
seeing alignment, right? Yeah, exactly. The
Hmm.
shirt. Are we seeing that alignment in how the teachers would answer that question, or how parents would answer that question, or how it's being measured? And so coming at it from this measurement perspective is a little unique for probably a lot of your audience, but also looking across so many different programs is unique. And so I think taking the control that you're given, as small as it may feel, and really putting your stakes down on what you believe and figuring out, are there ways of measuring that? Are there ways of defining this? Maybe traditionally through assessments, like in my example of this large school district implementing iPads for the first time. Or maybe it's something that's just very personal to you as a teacher and how you're just noting how kids are interacting with each other and taking notes on that to help you track, is this something that I'm doing that's making a difference and something I care about? And so as we think about this really good question, I think this contextual opportunity, the fact that it's nebulous and evolving, and the fact that we have a little bit of definition, and we're part of that evolution as educators and as school leaders. And let's not forget that. And so that's where someone like me can come in and say, okay, you care about, creativity, 21st century skills, whatever you want to define. We were just working with a project with Harvard's Project Zero, right? Like they've defined what are these characteristics. We're working with the Habits of Mind. They're defining what are characteristics for students to be successful. So as these conversations happen, we can support that hopefully with maybe some data or some reflective opportunities so people know if we're tracking this in the right direction. So that might be your longest answer to the
I
simple.
mean, that is a nuclear bomb of an answer. And thank you, because I think what really fascinated me when we had this initial conversation, our first talk, was that, I have these great conversations with amazing minds across the country and even world. And the one thing that we're starting to understand is exactly what your research is driving, which is it's a reverse engineering of what does this location, culture, collective culture, socioeconomic culture, if you will, how does that drive success to that, whatever it may be, micro school system or county school system, or and so we've kind of come to this collective understanding without really saying it all together, if you will. We're in these silos saying we have to work on a framework to put whether it be a macro school system or a micro, private school, we have to put everyone through this process, meaning school leaders, meaning educators, to allow for the understanding of what smart, right, means to that community, and then ultimately how that affects the larger picture. Because I think it's two parts, right? We talk global competency, and then we talk local, as I think about it, competency. And obviously, we're looking at a more global world. And so, how is that micro? I always think of, like, talking about iPads, and even beyond that, like the Amish community that's, not necessarily exploring iPads or technology, that outcome looks different, contextual to their life. But then how does that play on that global competency, going back to those characteristics that you're talking about? It's like, what are these human values that we need in order to grow as a society and grow as a world? And ultimately, for me, my mission has always been to value intelligence beyond what a standardized test reflects, right? That looking at an artist that may be a little off kilter, socially, let's say, that creates the most beautiful, whatever it may be, is valued at the same as someone graduating from MIT going into programming, that we kind of
So
culturally
I'll
look as
challenge
smart.
you right there, actually.
Okay.
It's a great example. And I love that example because I think about it personally a lot because I so appreciate and love the arts just personally. And can we create educational systems and opportunities where that kind of expression is allowed, first of all,
Mm,
recognized, nurtured, and celebrated? And there are educational settings where I've been fortunate enough, I didn't personally attend them as a student.
right.
I mean, if you were lucky academically, you were celebrated. The valedictorian was the person with the highest GPA. The person who won the next award was the person who had the highest number of points, in their respective teams. So there were very
Right.
clear lines of celebration, but a very creative artist or someone who came up with an amazing metaphor or
Mm,
a new idea or created a problem for their parents' restaurant and how they set up tables, something like that. Do we create cultures to recognize and celebrate that? And to go back to the mission, we actually see in school mission statements for primary and elementary school this nature of a global competency and or a local competency. And we've actually looked at different kinds of educational settings, like,
mm,
California public elementary schools compared to, we haven't looked at Amish yet as a collection, but compared to, say, Waldorf schools in
yep.
America, elementary schools. And do we see a difference in how they're espousing different values in their mission? And I think it's fair to say, in that example, we saw more global values represented in the public California school and than we saw in the Waldorf. I don't remember how local played out. But this idea is that the definition of success is really broad, and just look to your mission, look to what's on the wall. And I'm pretty positive, if you're like most schools in the world, that you'll have a multifaceted definition there of a mission, a success. And it's not just going to be academic and cognitive and what's in those academic tests, but it's going to be around social, emotional development, competencies around being a local informed citizen and participant in your community, a global participant and awareness. So that's actually a great starting point locally. And when you also said micro, this opportunity to think like, yes, I've talked about big level research, and researchers love that because, the larger numbers you get, the more opportunities
The
you can see.
cooler it sounds. Yeah.
Exactly. And the more opportunity you might have to find patterns or
That's right.
intricacies that we lose when we only work with 25 kids in a school year.
That's right.
I mean, so that is the value of having people looking at that, looking at the big night sky versus just studying that one plant on that one, region. And so with that, though, I think there are these, opportunities to think even more micro, like the classroom. And what
Mm,
does teacher value? And that really matters. I mean, what a teacher personally values and what drives them to wake up in the morning and, plan a great lesson often is more than just that academic and cognitive component as well. And that translates all the way to the student and the parent. So when you think micro, we can actually move from this like government, county, the United States, this collection of schools down to like a state or a county or a school district, to a school, to a classroom, to a teacher, and then a student and their parents and family. And that each one of those has that community and that context that you described. And I think that definition in the most effective classrooms
mm.
I've worked at, there's some congruence, there's some through line there that when I talk to a teacher, there's some match to what the school level leader might be saying. And hopefully that matches kind of the community, the larger community or district level goal. And maybe that even translates to what the student and, when going in the other direction to the student and parent. So.
Yeah, and I think ultimately thinking about the framework, I kind of envision now again lofty dreams here. I kind of envision a world where it's a very similar framework for all of those experiences, and as such, each of them feels personal, whether it's the macro or the micro. And what I'm fascinated with is that through line because that through line in your experience, and even in my experience as a school leader, and kind of, big thinker when it comes to these things, that through line, I think ultimately one is bubbling up the need for social, emotional, learning in classrooms, character values, character traits, I'm sorry, moral values. And the problem I think right now is we know these things. There's so much, qualitative and quantitative research that points out exactly what we're saying. Yet I know my real experience where I live is in Loudoun County, one of the most affluent counties in the country, as well as Fairfax County, right next to it, another of the most affluent, much more diverse, however. Both of these school systems have SEL programs, the Positivity Project. Here's the differentiator: the implementation, the training. Because what ends up happening is, how much can you absorb when it comes to talking about empathy in a 1 hour assembly where you have a character dancing around, every empathy or whatever it may be, when we know that these these values can best be translated by embodying those practices as adults and having the children feel what empathy is, giving to the homeless hand to hand, these kind of experiences dictate empathy. Yet I think the implementation is so off that it almost becomes a moot point. It almost puts parity to these issues for children.
Yeah. And it
So
becomes the next thing that's kind of paraded out, and here's what we need to work on now. This is mandated, it's top down, it's not organic, it's not, even if it is addressing a need, it doesn't feel like it is. And so it's like, serving boiled broccoli. You know this is the healthiest thing you should eat right now. And it's like, yeah,
right.
that could be the case, but you're not going to change someone's diet that way, most likely. And we know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I see as the most kind of powerful tool in training educators is to really, because I think educators, as we all know, and even you said yourself, like, I didn't wake up one morning and go, I want to get into educational research. It's this calling, it's this passion, it's this pull towards this career. And unfortunately, just like the school system, we're all born with intrinsic motivation to learn. And through these processes of kind of standardizing learning and standardizing teacher training and education, it's squashed out of them. And so I feel like the real power is providing agency in those experiences, going back to that center line, that, understanding the macro to micro of what we're assessing here. And so I would ask you, based on, one of your studies around mission statements, which is fascinating. Can you recall any of those center points specifically? Because I would love to know.
Yeah, we could look at it like from kind of an anthropological perspective, like how are schools changing? So you mentioned, like you felt like we're seeing this increase in what were character traits and values, and indeed there is. We can measure that. We can look at mission statements from 20 years ago, and we can look at mission statements today and actually show the percent of those traits that have increased, and they have.
Wow.
In short, schools are, and what's interesting is they're not giving up much. So most schools, and this is like the lived experience of every educator and every school leader I know in America, it's like we're adding things without necessarily giving anything up. So in our mission
That's
statement,
so true. Yep.
we're adding kind of like, oh, we'll add a social emotional component. We'll add this on character traits, but we're not giving up, academic rigor. And because of this, so I think the framework is an important piece because the framework gives the visibility to the idea. And
Oh,
that's
yes.
really important, first of all, in my experience and in the research as well. And then second, how teachers for me are the gatekeepers, and rightly so, of good technology and good teaching and bad teaching. And if a teacher wants something to work and they're ineffective, they'll figure it out. And if a teacher doesn't have time,
So true.
but teachers close their door and they do what they can in that period of time. And so teachers have still, even in these most automated, rigid systems, a lot of leeway and ability to serve kids in the moment. And there's huge power in that. And what we know is what will drive a teacher in the moment is their beliefs, as you said. And
Mm,
if they believe that technology is something that's really important for these kids' future, and they foundationally think themselves that, like, if these kids don't understand this concept, they're not going to be successful, they will approach that new technology or that lesson very differently than the teacher across the hallway given the same curriculum who believes that this is a passing fad. Oh, if I can just like kind of ignore this, it'll go the way of the Palm Pilot, or whatever they
the
made me have
BlackBerry.
to. Yeah,
Yeah.
whatever it was, like 5 years ago, whatever the trend du jour was. And there is some truth to that as well. But the difference is like teachers do what they believe. Like their belief is a huge predictor of whether they'll implement multi-million-dollar investments in programs. And if a teacher doesn't feel like this is something that's valuable or going to help their students or is aligned with their framework and their indicators, it's going to be the traction will be difficult. Whereas when there's that alignment, when there's a through line or congruence, going to the mission, going back to that foundation. And this is what, so what a teacher does when they close the door really matters, like what they think. And so getting teachers to understand the opportunities and capacity can be really critical. And it's not like we need to just brainwash teachers, but it's truly that, if you're, providing 5-year-olds support all day long, you're probably not reading the research at night or listening to 3 or 4 podcasts on, I'm my family, my wife's a teacher. I know all my friends are educators. Like they don't talk about that much. They talk about the kids. They talk about how to
That's
help
right.
the kid. What do you do when this kid can't get through this block or something like that, behaviorally, emotionally? They're not talking about the theory. So the opportunities to, I think it falls a little bit on the school leadership,
Mm,
to not just like sell the product or say, hey, we're an iPad school now, or hey, we're using this new framework or this new pedagogy. It's really about what is the underlying problem and need, and addressing that within, having teachers really resonate with that and seeing that this might help. And when those investments are made, whether it's a product or a framework or just an idea, it really is, that's been my experience. So like, it's really challenging to think of how do you steer this massive ship, right? But that's one thing that can happen, I think, in almost any school, is having that conversation. And if the culture isn't there yet, maybe doing it anonymously through a blinded survey or something, just to get a read on how people feel and then share that back and
I
start
think
culture.
y-
So, that those are some ideas of how that congruent thread line, we might start to turn it more into a rope, have more people holding on to it, right?
clip that, clip that. No, that beautifully said, beautifully said. No, I think you're absolutely right in that sense. And I think there's two questions that pop to my mind. The first is talking about buy-in, right? And talking about belief is so important. And it pulls up in my head. I don't know if you've heard of the SAMR format. It's a change management format. And as such, one of the things that always sticks out to me when it comes to that is it's a framework, basically, is that when something new is introduced, its response, the typical human response is uninformed pessimism. So they're already going to be like, nope, I don't want to use it. But if you can do exactly what you said, which is to identify pain points in their experience and to assist those pain points in practice, human to human, talking about technology as a support. This is where the human is important, guiding someone through how this makes their job easier, showing them, having them feel it, tends to be, as you said, and as I've experienced, tends to be the best way to introduce overall that change when whatever that tool may be, talking about the latest greatest. We won't even see true outcomes of those tools, in my opinion, unless they're introduced in a way that addresses the problem, which is this pessimism. So the second thing that it brings up for me is, do you see, we're in a teacher hiring crisis, right? We're into this huge crisis in our industry alone, 300,000 childcare employees, meaning anywhere between infant to pre-K and kindergarten, out of our network now. Do you equate that to the school system not agreeing with the average educator's beliefs? Would you say that plays into this overall kind of exodus from our industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole lot of reasons, and obviously teacher compensation and professionalism in the field have not kept standard with some other countries where they're not having teacher crisis, and that's an easy thing to
You're like,
like.
yeah,
I mean, if you compensate, teaching is hard work. Um,
absolutely.
it's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of challenges there. It requires a diverse set of skills, and not it's just not for everyone. And so I think it's part of the bigger problem, I think. I mean, it's easy to just say, if we just listened to teachers more and gave them more autonomy and gave them more resources. And I work in systems where that's true. I know I work in schools where teachers work harder and work longer and make less money because they believe in the school. They love the mission of the school. It is congruent with who they are as a person, and they are driven by that passion. And it's an amazing, when you have that leader and that culture, and it can attract those teachers, you don't necessarily have, that's a rarity in my opinion. And
Very much so.
more often is the case is that's a constant struggle of culture, profession, just the professional nature of teaching. It can be demoralizing. And I think sometimes the more numbers and quantify, like the more teachers feel like they're just delivering a curriculum, the less it's like there's other jobs you could have. That's not
That's right.
become teachers. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and we have studied kind of what correlates to teacher well-being. and internationally. And we've looked at actually hundreds of schools around the world over the last few years in a study where we looked at what what correlates with teachers saying they're looking at other jobs, they're not satisfied, they don't feel like they're effective anymore. And this is self-reported survey data, but it was anonymous. And again, we had about 3,500, we'll say, classroom teachers, pre-K through 12. So
Wow.
big mix of teachers all over the world. And the things that correlated with teacher satisfaction and like a desire to remain a teacher included what happened in the classroom. And just pause for a second there. So looking at everything else, like the decisions teachers made about pedagogy were correlated with their, in this case, their desire to stay a teacher and their satisfaction. So the more project-based, the more student-centered, the more they kind of flipped from a teacher-centered to a student-centered model, the more rewarding and the more satisfied teachers, that we saw that positive relationship. The least rewarding kinds of practices were having kids like do rote learning, taking notes, submitting assignments through, through technology tools. Those were not meaningful to teachers generally. But, when we looked across that broad swath and looked for center lines or, what's that thread through all of these teachers' experiences, what they did in the classroom, the more they invested in projects that took like more than a week to complete, the hard stuff, the more they collaborated with other teachers outside of their typical silo, the richer overall they felt. Now, it didn't make them any less tired. It didn't make them feel like they were getting enough sleep anymore. Like they still had all these other issues that teachers talk about with their personal well-being that are important, but they weren't checking the classified ads as often. And they were feeling like they were more empowered and more in charge of their own self. And that was meaningful. The second piece was funny. And this is something, again, like I was surprised by. The number one personal attribute wasn't like nutrition or like I get a lot of exercise. It was sleep. Like
Interesting.
like if you wake up and feel like you got a good night's sleep, pretty much a teacher is unstoppable that day. Like that seemed to be like one takeaway. That was like a universal, like, some people just work out and they get a lot out of it. Some people are really good about nutrition and they get a lot out of it. But one universal, whether you're a kindergarten teacher or an AP physics teacher,
Sleep.
if you're sleep deprived, everything else suffers.
And the irony is that most teachers are sleep deprived.
Yeah. And so like we're encouraging people, track your steps and, get healthy, but it's like, maybe just like go to bed earlier. Like maybe I'm still waiting for like a really effective school leader, right? Maybe listening to this podcast will launch like, a napping campaign or, award teachers who, have, a Fitbit and log like the most perfect week of sleep will get like a gift certificate to get like brand new king size pillows for their bed at the end of the month, or let's celebrate a good night's sleep for teachers, right?
And I hope there are administrators, which I know there will be, watching this that will, start thinking about that. And because you're so right, I think one of the things that in developing my own school system that I've learned is it kind of exactly that is. There's a couple of things that I see, and you've called them out already, but I'm just speaking to my anecdotal experience, which is, I know what teachers are motivated by because I am a teacher. That's how I started my career. Money. We all want to say it's, but it is. There's, Freakonomics is real. Money's a motivator, and a passion. Right? A belief that we're talking about. I always think about it as your care is sincere and your intention is good. And as an educator, if you possess those values in our industry, you most likely will be at least successful to how I define it, which is to touch, many kids' lives out there and inspire them to be authentically who they are and how they learn. But we reward We survey our parents directly about their experience and all of that, but that's rewarded through cash bonus. We also have this really cool and interesting culture around our school that I call surprise and delight. So, talking about moral values and character traits, we want our kids to see that. And so how we define that is 2 random acts of kindness per week per employee. And that can be done to a child, that can be for a parent, that can be for a fellow staff member. And that alone, right, inspires them, because I think teachers, and this is where I want to take this conversation, which is your work on pandemic studies and post-pandemic studies, and looking at the work that you've done there. I see that parents are deeply invested, even more so in their child's education, because it was shoved in their face, right? It was, kids are at home. Now I have to be an educator in some senses. And then educators are at school figuring it out. You know what I mean? Like having
Yeah.
no idea how to do it. And where I see that we saw a dramatic, again, talking about this hiring crisis, was this double down on judgment, collectively across the country, Loudoun County being the big voice for that in the news of, here's what we think is going on in classrooms comparative to, and again, that's some AI thing, but comparative to the classroom, where teachers are going, what are you talking about? Like, what is this conversation even about? And so I would love to kind of know from you if there was any alignment in that thinking of or understanding in your work and studies to, talking about what future education looks like, that, we've seen an educator, exodus, as I had mentioned before. But in your pandemic studies, what did you learn about learners and educators in general, both positive and negative?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And you know, I thought I could have told you the whole trajectory of my career before the pandemic. It was such a disruption,
Mm,
so much. And, we had studies underway all over the world and, boarding passes we were looking at, and it was a real disruptive time, obviously. But one of the really interesting things for us in terms of thinking about opportunities is it really shed a light on equity in a
mm,
new way. And there's a lot of ways to think about equity. And, we often think about it in terms of just the resources of a community. And, some parents have a lot of resources and some kids have none. And as a classroom teacher, we're very used to, some kids are getting read to every night and some kids don't have a book at home. And that's the reality there. And I think school and the school experience, for better or worse, have become kind of an equalizer and a normalization in a lot of communities around the world for the range that we have in the United States between our poorest and our richest. And I'll note here that our studies of achievement and educational quality in the United States show that US schools are as good as any school in the world. We have schools in the United States that can compete with any school in the world, essentially. And we have
interesting.
the worst schools also in the world. And we have schools that score as low or lower as some of the most impoverished educational systems anywhere. So we have this amazing, as amazing is the wrong word, this dynamic range or variance that we're serving as a nation. And I think the pandemic and public education kind of cracking and private education and everyone just kind of forcing to look at the system realized how inequitable everything is in one sense. And from a learner perspective, some schools were able to just jump right in, and some schools gained traction. I mean, I've worked in some
That's right.
schools that gained enrollment and they gained, programs, and it really forced them to be more creative and more thoughtful. And one of the programs I had studied through our work at Boston College was called the Ed Connect program. And this was in Chattanooga, Hamilton County, Tennessee. This is a school district serving about 65,000 students. So pretty big size, 550 square mile area, with
Wow.
mountains and stream, really dynamic. And everything from, very high achieving, successful students to kids who can't get them in the door and parents don't value education. And when you took that equity, the great equalizer of public school and private education every day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year out, you could really see those fissures in the community. And unlike most communities, they were able to leverage a whole lot of good history and a lot of good infrastructure to provide a community broadband program. And what that did is it provided the schools this new way of thinking about equity, that we know every parent now has a connection. So if we need to bring in a parent for a diagnostic like IEP meeting, it's no longer the parent who doesn't have a job and is a stay-at-home mom or could take time off work and drive to the school in the middle of the day for this meeting with a counselor, and that meeting might get delayed a half hour and you can't leave.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden, parents are coming into they're on Zoom, they're on Skype, and they're actually finding that more parents who were never at an IEP can now attend. And so little things like that provided more opportunity to leverage the technology that we share in ways that can level the playing field and provide opportunity. Now, as schools came back online, some of the more traditional schools were quick to say, we want to go back to the way things were the good old days, pre-pandemic. IEPs will be in person and all other meetings, without
Hmm.
realizing that they were actually making life really, and
Yeah.
I think they actually, they since we studied that, we gave them data, they reflected on that, and I think they changed the policy such that anywhere in any of the schools in the district, if you want to do the IEP on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever your technology of choice is, they can easily accommodate that. And attendance by parents and counselors and teachers at IEPs has increased because of this. So I know that's a very narrow, like, mile deep, inch wide view of that question, but it
Yeah.
provides that, like, for me, what's exciting as a researcher, those opportunities, there's an expression like when the light comes through the doorway, people realize then what the opportunities are. Like, and
Yes.
so much in education is that inspirational, like, wait, we can do this. Like, we used to do it this way. We inherited this system of student assessment, or we inherited this system of having IEP meetings in person. But all of a sudden, we realized it doesn't have to be that anymore. And we are in control. And so a school can have the jurisdiction or a community to change that. And that is a very powerful idea because that's actually a demonstration of learning and of what we're
Oh,
expecting our students and teachers to be doing, right? I mean, it's like
amen.
that information, processing it and evolving it. And I think as disruptive and challenging as the pandemic was as a parent, as a researcher, as someone who lives in schools, it put cracks through the under the doors. And in some places they were able to pounce on that light and innovate and build new tools. Some places slammed the door shut as fast as they could. And I think we're feeling repercussions. I think there's communities that are still, I know, that are really sore and are like going after schools in an aggressive way that previously it never really gave a damn, quite frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
it did shine the light on practices, and there's a lot of bad data, I think, supporting some of that. But my hope is that transparency and good information will ultimately serve
Shine
us
through.
well, and schools being proactive in your question and teachers being proactive and realizing that they do have this powerful idea and agency, at least a little bit, for defining what smart means and helping identify it such that it is equitable and meaningful within the context of why you're in the classroom and why this school exists in the first place. Because you have this amazing
Uh-oh.
opportunity, right? I mean, you've
Uh,
created this, this dream for people, and they're in it. And so this is the promise of that for me. So it's this is the golden age, truly, of how we use data and research in education to support that. And it's to go back to SAMR and to go back to that model, it's really easy to focus on those low levels. And that's the comfort zone. And that's okay. We can get efficiency, we can get some improvements there. But the real growth, the real learning comes when we create a culture and we can embrace those larger opportunities. And we can say, just because we've always done it this way, doesn't mean that we have to continue doing it only this way in the future. And that's powerful. And that's within all of our scopes, I believe.
yeah, I mean, you said it right there and brought it right back to exactly, I think, what teachers, administrators, students um, hear as well, which is positivity. I hear the positivity in your voice. I hear the tone in general when it's easy to complain. And I think as long as there's more folks just like you out there doing that work with that mindset of positivity, I think we will leverage, which is what I'm trying to do with the foundation, which is to leverage this time, these cracks, these holes that are apparent, to turn that boulder over the hill. The boulder's there. It's big, it's ready to roll. And I think overall, as long as, like you said, teachers and educators can keep that sacred knowing that, going back to what you said, policy can be policy, standards can be standards, but what really matters is even more micro than that, which is student to educator. How many of these meaningful moments can you create? And I think that is the future of education, and ultimately, what is smart. And it's interesting because we talk about technology in such a impactful way, but what technology ultimately is pointing out is the need for more human connection, which is, I think, ultimately the most interesting thing. So we could talk forever, Dr. Bebell, but I think you gave probably the most whole answer to what is smart. And of course, it's from someone that, you know, quantifies schools and understanding what they determine as smart to be. So I thank you so much for your time today. I thank you for your words, your vision, your positivity around the improvement of educational experiences across the board. We really, really thank you. Is there anything that you're currently working on that you'd want people to check out for your own personal brand?
We have a website, Reflective Educational Research, where we will occasionally remember to toss in a few links or a few ideas. But as far as I know, I'm the only Damian Bebell floating around on the planet. I would encourage you just to reach out, check out any of the research, bring in questions, find me on LinkedIn. We'd love to connect, love to talk about this. It's what we do. We're in this together. And
Yeah,
you could say that, I appreciate the kind words you said, but part of this experience that I've had in my view and my perspective comes from I've never had the responsibility of teaching in a classroom. I mean,
mm,
I've taught graduate school, I've advised dissertations, but the skill set, the patience, the wisdom required to be a successful educator day in and day out is, just magical to me. And I do not believe that I possess some of those inherent skills, and certainly haven't learned about them or trained. I know a few pedagogical tricks that'll get me out of trouble when the teacher walks out of the room and leaves the researcher. But generally, I'm glad to share this perspective from kind of the egg-headed side of, Boston College research. But it's really been, what's really, the action's really at the classroom with the kids, with the teachers, day in and day out. That's where the magic happens. And I only get to kind of peripherally learn from that and try to surmise. So that's any credit I can take would be reflected right back to the kids that have shared their wisdom with me and teachers over the years.
Amen to that. Thank you again. And we're going to leave it there because that was beautifully said. I'm going to go ahead and hold on.